Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. So today is our final part in our three-part series on making better financial decisions. So we started by just unpacking what influences our current situation and the way that we see it, our family background, our money motivators, things that actually change the way we process information and reference points that we're using in order to inform decisions we're making now. And then we also unpacked the risk that we have of assuming that things that happened in our past will determine our future, that we'll make decisions based on the experiences we've had in the past that may actually be counterproductive. And today we're going to finish up this conversation by talking about financial crisis. This is going to be really important if you are in church leadership and you are meeting with families who are coming to the church in financial crisis. It's also really important for us to just understand about ourselves. How do we approach these situations when they come? And I say when they come because they will come. We will find ourselves in situations where we get sucker punched by some unexpected big expense. And a lot of times we assume that all of that is just mathematical, that we're going to just walk into every financial crisis with this really clear understanding of all the ins and outs and how it affects us, and we're going to make really clear-headed decisions. What I have found is that is not what happens. What happens more often than not when we are in a situation where we have this sudden financial crisis, whether it's a medical expense we didn't see coming, or it's a car that breaks down and needs serious cost to repair, or maybe we have a household appliance or the furnace goes out, or something that we didn't see that's going to cost thousands of dollars that we don't have, and we go into a crisis mentality. And that is not where we do really good math, right? When we are in a crisis mentality, what happens in our brain physiologically is fascinating. The part of our brain that makes decisions when we are in crisis is called the amygdala, and it is very rapid. It is all about avoiding threat, self-protection, moving in directions that get away from the thing we're afraid of. And because it is so overwhelming, we feel this sense of desperation to make these decisions that our brain wants us to make in order for it to feel safer. Our brain is really ineffective in a lot of ways because it gets in its own way. The part of our brain that actually does the math, that thinks logically and rationally, is called the prefrontal cortex. And it's an incredible design. God's design of that particular part of our brain is just beautiful. It's awe-inspiring. What it's capable of doing when it kicks in and when we're able to really engage with it is a supercomputer kind of power. And yet we're making decisions in crisis from the part of our brain that is really about fight or flight. And so we end up fighting against ourselves more often than not when we're in these crisis moments. And we need to understand what's happening, not just in our own experience, but also when someone comes to us and is seeking guidance, seeking help. We need to make sure we're meeting them in that space and actually helping them buy some time for that amygdala response to settle down so that the prefrontal cortex, the incredible design of God's decision-making center in our brain, can kick in. It takes a while. And one of the things that gets in the way more than anything else is emotional reaction to that crisis. What are we making that crisis mean? Because that changes everything. Whenever I interact with someone who's in financial crisis, I'll hear them use extreme language. Things like, we're never going to be able to, or I'm always going to be stuck with. There's some language that speaks to an inevitability and an inescapability, this forever kind of mentality that is extreme, but it's understandable. Their brain has made this situation mean that they will lose everything, that they will have to sacrifice anything and everything that they enjoy, that we like to experience. We have to cut everything out. We're going to have to sell the house. We're going to have to sell the cars. We're going to have to do all of these extreme things. But most of those extreme things are part of that deep emotional response of panic that can set in when we get that surprise and we get sucker punched. What I want us to do as leaders and what I want us to do with ourselves is hold space with patience. Allow that emotion to run its course. And it may be a really painful emotion. Maybe if it's a health diagnosis that's really devastating, it can send us into a deep sense of despair, and that makes sense. I understand that. That is absolutely right and logical, and yet, in that sense of despair, you will not make good decisions. You will end up perpetuating problems, making things worse. You may end up missing opportunities to make it better because you see things as hopeless. Those kinds of emotional states can really block us from taking steps that actually move us forward. And then as we stay stuck, what happens is our brain now has evidence to prove to us that it was right, that we're never going to get out of this. It's never going to get better. And so we only get further and further into that cycle of emotion and despair when we see proof because of our inaction or our missed opportunities to make progress. We only see evidence that this sense of being trapped or these extreme never or always statements, we see proof that they're true, even if they're not. We just need to be able to sit with emotion as uncomfortable as it is. God designed emotion. Jesus wept. He felt deep, painful emotion because it is what we do as humans. It's part of the human experience. We don't need to be afraid of it. We don't need to overreact in order to make it go away, because in that overreaction, we may actually make things worse and cause it to stick around longer than we want it to. One of the ways that we think about that state that we get in is being emotionally hijacked. And that's a great way to think of it. A lot of times I've heard people refer to it as flooding, that our brain is just taken over by this extreme experience of emotion. And that flooding, that emotional hijacking that happens, blocks all of the rational and thoughtful parts of our brain, and they get in the way of our ability to experience clear-headed decision-making. So let me give you an example of a situation that might feel familiar. Maybe you've worked with people that have been in this situation, or you've even faced this yourself. Let's say, for example, that there's a large cost to repair your car. Maybe it needs some transmission work, and it's going to cost a couple $1,000s. One thing I've seen people do in that situation is they will panic and they will just go buy a new car. And so rather than paying $2,000 to repair the car they have, they go and they spend $40,000 or $35,000 to get in debt for a car that doesn't have that problem. But they may put themselves now, from a cash flow standpoint, in a position where everything else just got harder to afford. And they can tell themselves, see, I knew that when this car broke down, it would wreck me financially. But it wasn't the $2,000 cost of repairing that car that wrecked them. It was what they did in that emotional reaction to that cost by going and saddling themselves with more monthly payment than they could afford because they were in that emotional reaction. They got emotionally hijacked, and they made a decision that was not thoughtful and patient. Those are the kinds of things we need to help people avoid. And one of the most valuable ways we can do that is by being present in their state of being emotionally hijacked without getting hijacked ourselves. And so one of the things I tell myself when I'm sitting with someone is they're going to tell me things that they believe are true. They believe that they will never be able to enjoy their life again. They believe that they will always be stuck with this debt. They will tell me that, and they want me to tell them that's true. They want someone to agree with them. We end up talking to friends, asking them to get emotionally hijacked with us. It's almost like if you're drowning and you reach up for the lifeguard and pull them into the pool and step up on their head and try to get out, both of you end up getting sucked under, right? We end up in situations where we have to stay out of the pool. In the leadership role in that relationship, when we're talking to someone who's emotionally hijacked, our job is to not let them pull us in to their emotional flooding. They're allowed to have it, for sure. It makes sense. But our job is to help them access the rational part of their brain by getting them through that emotional hijack state without actually getting hijacked ourselves. And this is a really hard thing to do, particularly when it's someone that you love. If you're talking to someone who is in your family or a dear friend or someone who's part of your community that is really going through a hard thing, staying out of the pool and not getting sucked in is very, very hard because the pain of this situation can be contagious. And so it is really important that we gather together with others around us and we agree ahead of time when we're engaging with someone who's in crisis that our job is to avoid that flooding and to stay out of that emotional hijack state so that we can actually help this person who is in this fear brain make rational decisions. And so if I have a friend that's in crisis and they call and they gather a couple of us to talk about what's going on, one of the things I'll do is I'll ahead of time talk to those friends that we're going to go have this conversation with this other person and say, hey, remember, our job is to listen. Our job is to let them vent, to let them process, to help them feel the emotion. But one of our most important jobs is to stay rational and thoughtful. That doesn't mean we're not empathetic. It doesn't mean that we don't have sympathy for them. We absolutely do. But if we end up in the pool with them, then they will feel more confident about making the wrong decision because we will only reinforce to their brain that this panic is right, that these extreme statements are correct, because we're telling them, yeah, that's right. That's probably true. You're never going to be able to do that again. And you're right. It does mean you're always going to be buried in this and you're never going to get out of it. We can only be an advocate for them if we're able to stay out of the pool and invite them patiently to access that prefrontal cortex part of their brain and start to think rationally and thoughtfully about the situation they're actually facing. If you are a person who is in crisis, one thing that I really want to say to you is do not ignore the advice of your friends who have stayed out of the pool. When I am in a panic mode and I'm telling someone about something I'm panicked about, it's really easy for me to dismiss their thoughtfulness as being cold or callous or disconnected. But if they are doing their job well and they can stay empathetic and sympathetic, however, they don't get sucked into the pool, their advice, their direction, their ability to think clearly and critically and make rational decisions is priceless. And sometimes simply because we're not hearing something that confirms what we think, we will dismiss that person or we will say, well, forget it, I'll go talk to somebody else. And we end up going around until we find someone who will get in the pool with us. We find someone who will flood emotionally, who will join our emotional hijack and confirm what we are thinking because we want to be right. Even when we're wrong, we want to find people who will tell us that we're right. And so that is a really important piece. If you are the one in crisis, this is why we seek wise counsel, why we get people involved that can stay unemotional and rational and guide us through the process rather than joining us in the despair and the hopelessness. It's really critical that we allow this emotional flooding to clear itself out before we start making any drastic changes. That we seek the relational connection with people who can join us in this conversation and then help us to see what our options actually are, because we will be blinded to the options that are in front of us. And particularly when we're talking about financial situations, we can really quickly exacerbate problems by compounding on more and more debt, increasing our monthly payments, making decisions that don't just harm us for one day or even 1 year, but sign us up for 6 or 7 or 30 years worth of pain. And those are the kinds of things that can really become difficult to escape because our brain now has so much evidence that we are in trouble. And so we need to sit in some of that emotion and let it clear out. Don't be afraid of anxiety. Don't be fearful of letting it have its way. We want to be able to let that emotion fully process, because we know on the other side, we will be much more prepared to actually face what we're facing. We are not meant to do crisis alone. We need to do it in community. It's one of the reasons why I think money in general needs to be less of a taboo topic, particularly in the church community. We need to be able to share what's really going on when it comes to money with our brothers and sisters, because wisdom comes from that community conversation, from being in life together and having someone be able to say, oh, I just dealt with something very similar 2 years ago. Let me tell you what I learned. But if we don't let anybody in and we just keep making decisions from panic and emotion that is painful, acting in a sense of despair and hopelessness alone because money is something we don't talk about, we will continue to perpetuate problems that continue to prove to our brains that we're never going to escape it, and that hopelessness builds on itself. We need each other to bring light into that darkness, to sit with each other in pain, recognize what it really means, and help make really thoughtful, rational decisions so that we actually can grab a hold of hope. We actually start to have the thought, I'm going to be okay. And that feeds on itself in a positive way, just as powerfully as the thought, I'm never going to get out of this, feeds on itself in a negative way. I think this is God's design, that we do life in community so that we can glean wisdom from each other, sit with each other in difficult times, and guide each other through things we can't see in isolation. It is a privilege. If you are in a leadership position in the church, this is a privilege to get to talk to people who are experiencing this kind of fear and crisis and be the non-anxious presence in their life that leads them out to a place of confidence and stability. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.